In this module, we will first go over the learning objectives, then move on to the top 10 tips for applying for research funding, and end with an expert video from Liza Bialy, the grants facilitator at CHEO. After Module 3, Applying for Research Funding, you will know which resources are available to residents applying for grants and how to access these resources. You will also be able to plan out funding applications with regard for deadlines while leaving reasonable time for completion. Tip number 10. Follow all guidelines. There is no point in applying to a granting agency if your proposed study is not eligible or your application is incomplete. Once you are certain that your study is eligible, create a checklist to keep yourself on track and to ensure that you do not miss any items required for the application. Adhere to the process outlined in the grant guidelines. For example, page limits, sections required, reference format required, signatures required, allowable items. Contact your local grants facilitator, Liza Bialy, or the granting agency if you are unsure about anything. There are no stupid questions. Tip number 9. Plan ahead. Plan out your application, leaving adequate time plus a little extra for all aspects of the study. Often, it's the administrative things that take the most time. Leave at least 1 week for signatures to avoid missing deadlines. And it's always a good idea to contact the grants administrator as soon as you decide to apply for a grant, so that they can make sure that there will be someone around to sign it once it is complete. Tip number 8. Model your application after previously successful applications, if possible. Model your grant application after previously successful applications to the same agency, if possible. Contact your local grants facilitator for examples of successful applications or the names of other individuals in your organization who might be able to provide you with some suggestions or advice. Tip number 7. Justify your budget. The granting agency will try to cut the budget in order to allow them to fund more studies. If you absolutely need funding in an area, prove it. Otherwise, it may be cut. Justify the need for the item first, and then the cost you have estimated in your budget. This is easiest when you have researched the costs and have the appropriate quotes. This is an example of a well-developed budget item. It is explained and then justified with the cost justified as well. Tip number 6. Use peer review. Peer reviewers, either internal or external, can evaluate the readability of your proposal, check for clarity and comprehension, and provide critical feedback on your overall proposal, including your study design and methods. Speak with your research supervisor or local grants facilitator to help you find a peer reviewer. By enlisting a reviewer, you will not only gain insight into the work itself, but also have fresh eyes to spot any errors that you may have missed. Tip number 5. Align granting agency objectives with your own objectives. Most granting agencies use their funds to further their objectives. Investigators whose research will help achieve these objectives are more likely to receive funding. If your objectives do not align with those of the agency, then you will only be considered for funding after all other investigators have been funded. The more your objectives line up with theirs, the more reason the agency will have to award you a grant. For example, the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada's Medical Education Research Grant encourages curriculum design and implementation, instructional methods, assessment, program evaluation, continuing education, professional development, and faculty development as research topics, while Physicians Services Incorporated Foundation encourages, in all of its grants, the education of practicing physicians and health research with an emphasis on research relevant to patient care. Tip number 4. Submit the application before the deadline. Submit all required documents and information together ahead of the deadline. A sloppy application, submitted in bits and pieces, or submitted after a deadline, leads reviewers to expect that the researcher is sloppy in all areas of their work, research included. Tip number 3. Contact the grants facilitator. As the research grants facilitator and administrator, Liza Bialy identifies funding opportunities, reviews and elicits applications to ensure compliance with agency guidelines and institutional policies, assists in the development of applications and proposals, implements best practices, and ensures accountability and compliance. She will be able to answer a lot of your questions related to funding applications and is a fantastic resource. Tip number 2, consult experts from outside your field. As the reviewers from the granting agency may not be experts in your particular field, you will want to avoid making your application too technical. A good test of this is to have experts from outside your field read over your application and provide you with their opinions. Your writing should be clear enough that a non-expert can understand. Consulting experts with other fields of specialty can also highlight new areas of weakness in your work and present you with an alternative point of view. Tip number 1, follow all guidelines. Tip 10 is also tip 1 because we cannot stress this enough. Check that the grant application meets all requirements before submission. Contact your local grants facilitator to go over all applications before final submission. One missing signature shouldn't be the reason your well-designed study doesn't take place.
Hello, my name is Liza Bialy, and I'm the Grants Administrator at the CHIO Research Institute. I'm responsible for assisting investigators, scientists, trainees, and all other appointees at the CHIO Research Institute with applying for research funding. Some of these tasks may include identifying grant opportunities, interpreting guidelines, as well as navigating online application systems, developing your budgets, as well as proposal review for adherence to the guidelines, and also obtaining signatures internally as well as from the University of Ottawa. And finally, any help that investigators need with submitting the final application. So all the main points with applying for grant applications have been covered very thoroughly in this module. But from the grants administrator perspective, I would like to emphasize a few points. Those being the thorough review of the guidelines, as well as the eligibility requirements prior to starting the application process. Also, it's really important to contact your grants administrator as soon as you know that you're going to be applying for an opportunity, as it could take several days, even up to a week, to obtain the necessary signatures internally and from the University of Ottawa. And lastly, don't hesitate to contact any of your colleagues, other scientists, or any of us here within the Institute for help. Thank you, and good luck with your applications.
Now that you have completed Module 3, Applying for Research Funding, you know which resources are available to residents applying for grants and how to access these resources. You are also now able to plan out funding applications with regard for deadlines while leaving reasonable time for completion. CHIO offers a resident research grant. All the information pertaining to this grant is available on CHIOnet. The Resident Research Grant is located on the Internal Funding Opportunities page, which is under the Grants and Pre-Awards section. Here you will find the guidelines for the grant and the application form that you need to submit in order to obtain the grant.